So, good? Can you all hear me? So, welcome to the April Health Forum. As you can see, we've got some wonderful sponsors of our Health Forum at UCLA through the Fielding School of Public Health. I also want to welcome our live streaming audience. If any of you either who are live streaming or even in the audience tonight would like to use your Twitter account to ask questions, we actually have a Twitter hashtag, which is FSPH for Fielding School of Public Health Forum, FSPH Forum. And that way, if you're feeling a little shy or you don't want to get your question in through standing up and waving your arm, you can always send a question that way too. So we're coming along into the 2015 year. My name is Leah Vriesman. I am the Director of Executive Education in the Fielding School in the Department of Health Policy and Management. I'm also an Associate Professor. It's good to see some of my students here and alum. We have a very exciting topic tonight. We are going to be talking about something that's been making a lot of headlines lately, and it's basically the cost of innovation. So everyone's talking about innovation, but specifically as it relates to drugs, drug innovation and the prices therein. A recent Forbes article stated that for companies that have launched more than 3 drugs, the median cost per new drug is $2 billion to bring it to market. Okay? For those that have launched more than 4 drugs, it's $5.3 billion. So as you can notice by this number, they're not getting an advantage for launching more drugs and spreading out fixed costs, but it's actually increasingly expensive to bring more drugs to market. Recent headlines about drug innovation have been all over the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, regular popular press. Titles recently in the Wall Street Journal, such as Big Pharma's Price Problem, has talked about the increased efforts to make patent exclusivity less of a barrier to competition. In fact, a major milestone just occurred as the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services issued new rules for encouraging the use of biosimilars, the copied versions of biopharmaceutical proteins. We're fortunate tonight to have Martin Zagari here from Amgen. He's a global health economist and will be talking from a perspective of value, what is value in drug innovation, and from his economist perspective. Also on our panel tonight is Ilan Rubinstein. He's a PharmD, and he's here tonight to offer insight into the pharmacist's struggle with supporting innovation while providing access and his perspective as a consultant to the industry. Some unanticipated situations have resulted lately in extreme drug costs and expenditures for businesses and insurers. And some of you may be familiar with Sovaldi and the hepatitis C treatments that have really been sort of a budget buster and have been in the news a lot. Finally, our third panelist is Alexander Ruggieri. And he is an MD, and he is in charge of the pharmaceutical utilization management for Anthem WellPoint. So you can see we have an economist from the industry, we have a PharmD by training and consultant, and we have the insurance industry executive who's also in pharmaceutical utilization management, which we think has done a nice job in rounding out the panel. The price of new drugs and special drugs has put the consumer perhaps out of reach, and so one of the things I know they're going to talk about is while innovation is important, how is it that we are going to make sure that the most common lay citizens still have access to the best drugs? So having kicked this off and hopefully baited you a little bit on some of the things our panel is going to speak of, I would actually like to invite first up Martin Zagari.
Great, thank you very much, Leah, and thank you for your introduction. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm actually going to start my brief presentation with a joke. It's very funny. And it goes something like this. Spending on medicines introduced in the past 5 years has outpaced all other drug spend.
hilarious.
Get it? No, just kidding. I raised that point because one of the reasons I enjoy coming to panels like this is because I think they are designed to actually get us into a bit more of a high-minded place where we can actually think about some of the problems and hopefully some of the solutions. The headline I gave you is an actual headline. And it's interesting because when you first read it, as most of you got the joke, right? When you first read it, it sounds outrageous, right? It's unsustainable. My God, all the medicines we've introduced in the past 5 years have grown the quickest. But that's in fact how drug discovery works, right? New medicines get introduced, they get taken up by the marketplace. Typically, the first 5 years of the take-up period is the steepest trajectory for those medicines. So by definition, the most innovative treatments that are certainly less than 5 years old are going to look like they're putting an outsized burden on the healthcare system. And so I actually start my introduction, with kind of a headline sleight of hand like that, because I think it's folks like you in this room, right, who actually probably understand a bit more, right, than your typical person on the street. And I hope that when many of you who have an interest in this area or have or study in an allied area, can come to appreciate what a complicated area drug pricing and drug development actually is. So I'm going to basically give a brief context for who I am. As Leah mentioned, I'm a health economist. I'm actually also a physician. I trained as an anesthesiologist before getting into more health services research and health economics. I've actually been doing health economics for about 20 years. I've done it in consulting. I did it with Johnson & Johnson back on the East Coast, and I've been at Amgen now for about 10 years. And I do it globally, which means we're wrestling with a lot of the healthcare and access issues worldwide. The US actually has one of the most complicated healthcare systems in the world, but as you can imagine, there's 70 or 80 countries where Amgen and most multinational pharmaceutical companies do business, and each one of those systems has a different way of grappling with healthcare challenges. Everything from the challenges of developing countries trying to introduce universality to healthcare to obviously the challenges of advanced countries like ours grappling with allocation and grappling actually with seeming to have hit maybe a ceiling of healthcare costs. So if you hear me break into global chatter, please just sort of forgive me for that because I'm used to thinking a lot about global markets as well, not just the U.S. So I'm going to divide my remarks into roughly three packets. I do want to spend some time talking about what we think is working reasonably well, because I think with the current dialogue, it often gets controversial really quickly, and you think that everything is hopelessly broken, nothing is working, everything is unsustainable, when in fact there are some things that are actually stable and working reasonably well. The second part, I'll get a bit more controversial and talk maybe about some of the things that hold us back, right, as a healthcare system in terms of the types of change many of us would maybe want to see, but the changes we may be locked out of, right, just because of the structure of the current system, right? And then I'll end packet 3 of remarks by tossing out perhaps some maybe equally controversial, but ideas for Q&A and solution finding, let's say. So let me start with a couple of things that are working and that are exciting. So the first thing, I want to start really at a macro level. And I want to say there's probably never been a more exciting time to be in healthcare and in biotechnology in particular. As a matter of fact, I've heard several individuals refer to the 21st century as the bio-century, let's say, because many people predict that huge innovations will come, right, in the understanding of disease and the development of human therapeutics. And we already have evidence that that's happening. So how many of you have heard of Moore's Law for technology, where essentially computing power doubles roughly every 18 months or so, right? And the cost actually either stays constant or in many cases goes down. Well, in terms of some aspects of biotechnology, we've actually eclipsed Moore's Law many-fold, as a matter of fact, by several orders of magnitude. Those of you familiar with the Human Genome Project probably know that it cost about $3 or $4 billion to sequence the first human genome. And it took several years to do so. And it was a heroic effort, right? And back as recently as 2000, that was amazing. And now we can actually sequence an entire human genome for less than $1,000. It's actually rapidly heading to several hundred. And we can do so in several hours, right? And there's talk that you actually may be able to have technology in 10 years that will do so in several minutes, right? So actually, when you look at the number of base pairs involved in the technology between 2000 and now, right, that makes Moore's Law look like a snail's pace. And one of the things we're excited about at Amgen is when you begin to essentially apply, right, the genome knowledge that we're getting, not now just from one person, but from every person, right? That's where the whole concept of personalized medicine comes from. When we can start to unlock the genome, and when we can start to essentially target products to the people who need them with a specific genotype that may allow them to react to that product in ways that are much more beneficial than our kind of one-size-fits-all products. And we think that actually is the future of medicine. But we're certainly in some growing pains right now, right? Because our system is currently not designed to accommodate that type of change, and I'll get into that in a moment. So let me start a little bit with, you know, the macro picture. There's a lot of headlines out there about unsustainable drug costs, but in fact, I think that, you know, it's not just drug costs, right? We have a healthcare system which appears to be becoming more expensive over time, not just drug costs, but hospital costs. And so I think the problem is a broader one, because when you actually drill down into medicines, the macro picture of drug treatment hasn't changed much, even in 10 to 20 years. For example, you know, 10 or 20 years ago, HIV medicines were going to bankrupt the system, right? And it didn't happen. Right. This year, Sovaldi was going to bankrupt the system, and many people are still saying it will bankrupt the system. And it's unlikely that that will happen. Actually, the percentage of the total healthcare budget that's drug spend has remained pretty constant at about 10 to 12% over the last 10 to 20 years, and is still about that number today. In Europe, actually, where where essentially they have more controls over healthcare pricing, the proportion of healthcare that's pharmaceuticals has actually declined in the last 5 or so years, right? So it used to be 12 to 13%, I believe, in Europe, and now it's trending towards about 11%. And that's another place where headlines of unsustainable cost of drugs are another fairly common feature. You know, I think one of the lessons here is that, you know, unsustainable trends are never sustained, right? And I think that, you know, our system in the US is pretty flexible, and it does have a way of ultimately dealing with these allocative issues. The HIV cost issue was obviously something that has played out extremely favorably. As a matter of fact, drug treatment for HIV is probably one of the best values we get. I would argue that Sovaldi is also very good value. And the issue with Sovaldi is actually more of a financing question, right, than it is it a good drug for the price that's being charged. It's really, how do you pay for it this moment for benefits that aren't going to accrue? And of course, you have no idea who they're going to accrue to, right, for 30, 40, 50 years, right? That is a tough problem, right? And I think it's a problem that all the stakeholders in the healthcare system has to face head on. Another feature of healthcare is that of drug treatment is that it's pretty unprecedented now that 86% of all prescriptions are generic medicines. And that figure is actually heading to over 90% by the year 2020. And that's pretty amazing, right? Because essentially it means that 9 out of 10 prescriptions are virtually no cost to society once they've essentially been developed and paid for. Right, and that's 9 out of 10. So all of the high-priced prescriptions are, in fact, about 1/10 of the healthcare budget. And therein lies the issue, and how I wanted to get to some things that are a bit more controversial and maybe tee up the Q&A. I would argue that one of the reasons we struggle is the mismatch between our healthcare system and the rate of change in biologics and in biotechnology. Our healthcare system is currently designed to accommodate pretty well slow changes incremental changes that basically where the benefit occurs at about the same time as the cost. I would call that short-term. So short-term benefits, benefits that accrue relatively slowly, and I'd also argue that the last 10 to 20 years of drug treatment has accrued modest benefits to tens of millions of people, right? And people have gotten used to medicines for GERD, medicines for diabetes, medicines for asthma, medicines for depression, medicines that essentially confer what some people might call modest benefits, again, to tens of millions. As a matter of fact, many of us probably have those medicines in our medicine cabinets. Now, in fact, many of the advancements in biotechnology are conferring larger benefits, but to a smaller subgroup of people, right? And there's medicines actually that we develop at Amgen that are for a mere 2,000 or 3,000 people a year. Medicines, for example, to treat acute lymphocytic like leukemia, which actually is essentially a fatal disease. And the medicine that we recently introduced actually doubles, or actually a bit more than doubles, the rate that people can actually respond to transplant and go on with a lifelong remission, right? And so I would argue that our system is actually facing an unprecedented time of how do you take a system that likes slow change, because all the resources are locked into their silos, that likes to pay for things where the person paying realizes the benefit of paying for it within a year or two. And if we come up with a vaccine for Alzheimer's disease, God help us paying for that one, right? But that's the kind of ideas that people are thinking about. And I think our system also likes this idea that if I pay into the system, I'm going to get something back. So this modest benefits. The new system seems to be, well, I'm going to look at my neighbor, and if he has a disease that only 3,000 people have, the question I have to ask as a healthy person paying into the system is, am I willing to pay premiums that allow therapies to be developed for 3,000 or 4,000 people, right? Am I okay with that shift in the insurance paradigm from everyone gets a bit to some very unlucky people actually get kind of the full court press of biotechnology? So that's my essential premise, is the system we have a bit rigid, the change that's coming amazing, and how do we marry the two together? And I think we're seeing that tension play out in things like drug pricing. And I think there's a few things we can do to help at least get on the same page. I think we do have to tackle things like one-size-fits-all consumer incentives, right? So I'm actually a fan of value-based insurance design, which actually incentivizes certain people to take higher value therapies or therapies for untreatable conditions than setting, for example, copays all at one level, no matter what the drug is. That's an idea, right? And I think there's many people out there that are actually championing ideas like that. I think we actually have to recognize that medicine's evolved and that not everything needs as heavy regulation as it has right now. Because I think actually the way that medicine has developed is where everyone really had to be protected from snake oil and procedures that weren't tested and medicines that didn't work. Now we have incredible amounts of data, right? So rather than regulate the healthcare, let's actually look at outcomes, right? Let's actually let services be done in cheaper settings of care than audit the results, right? So I think we're in an age where medicine just has to pull itself out of this kind of one-off mentality and into a productive, kind of setting, like many industries have changed to over time. And then finally, I think we need to keep the dialogue evidence-based and responsible. Another headline I recently saw was, it was the unfortunate situation of a generic medicine that had gone from about $30 to, I think it was $180, right? But the problem with that's one generic medicine. And it actually probably undermines the truth that generic medicines are one of the ways we're affording innovation, right? And the average generic medicine actually is quite a bit cheaper than it's ever been, right? So again, I would argue, let's talk about data, let's talk evidence-based, and let's kind of, try to get people away from the sensationalistic and actually solve problems rather than create them. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thanks, Martin. Alon?
Very good. And the clicker, yeah, that's the back and forth, so that when they're, and that's the pointer.
I'm sorry? Is it?
Very good. Well, thank you, Dr. Torrens. Thank you for inviting me as well. This is the overall discussion topic. I'm going to be more pharmacy focused. To define what are specialty pharmaceuticals, as opposed to what was brought up before that are the more common drugs. So the specialty pharmaceuticals are the ones that affect small populations, often give life, although the Gilead products are certainly an exception to that, and that cost a very large amount of money. They also have special handling requirements, and those make them special as well. So often these drugs are distributed and monitored and by what are called specialty pharmacies if they're in what is called the pharmacy benefit. Specialty pharmaceuticals can also be administered in a physician's office, in a hospital clinic, in a home health care setting, where they're part of the medical benefit and different rules apply, usually no drug formulary, different kinds of billing applies as well, fewer controls and less effective controls. So just to start, it's important when we're talking about drugs and value to know that there are, very grossly speaking, two categories of drugs, and that we're primarily, when we're talking about the new upcoming drugs that are costing a very great deal of money, talking over on this side. This is from a paper by Peter Bach and colleagues published last year. And what you see is drug price per year of life gained. And a quote from the paper, in 1995, patients and their insurers paid $54,000 for a year of life. A decade later, in 2005, they paid $139,000, and for the same benefit by 2013, they paid $207,000. So you see from this why a payer would be quite concerned, although most payers are not sophisticated enough to look at it in terms of drug price per year of life gained. They're going to be looking at it from the perspective of how much is this hurting my budget. So this is also from that same paper. And so in the rare instances where third-party payers have tried to place meaningful restrictions, in this case the Medicaid program in Oregon, on access to anti-cancer drugs, they've basically relented due to pressure from clinicians and patient advocacy groups. So this particular example has to do with the Oregon Medicaid program being quite upset at spending $100,000 for a survival benefit of 3 months. So this just sort of sets up the problem. So I'm a pharmacist, so I'm going to look at it from a pharmacy perspective to some extent. The first example is incentivizing patients to use cost-effective therapies, and I'm going to go through the pharmacy benefit and the benefit structure, mostly in high-deductible plans. The next one talks about a pilot that Newcomer did at United Healthcare on bundling and oncology, and the result of that, which was published recently. The next is an idea for how payment might be reformed in the pharmacy sector to enhance transparency. And the last is biosimilars as a new way to control some of these high-cost products and improve the value received after the patent of the product's end. So as far as the benefit design, so 20% right now, according to the Kaiser Foundation survey done last year, of employees are in high-deductible plans. And very likely by 2017, a very large fraction of employers, large and very large, will be using those high deductible plans. And the reason is pretty clear from this slide. So these are the prices, $10,000, $11,000 for more traditional health plans. And in consumer-driven health plans, which are basically high deductible plans with either a health, support for paying underneath the deductible. The cost is much less, and it's less either because the patients self-select into those plans because they're healthier. They have high cost sharing, so from the payer's perspective, there's less cost. And the utilization is lower, as I'll show in a moment. A large percentage of the very large employers are thinking that they will offer only these high deductible plans with some sort of a support underneath the high deductible for the patient. And that'll happen fairly soon, so there'll be less of an issue with adverse selection into these plans. One important thing to notice in the high deductible plan is that a very large fraction of them do not require, the deductible does not apply to the pharmacy benefit. That is the overall deductible. There can be a separate pharmacy deductible as well in some of these plans. Another thing to notice is that many insurers are going to co-insurance, a very large fraction, and that is increasing over time. The specialty pharmaceuticals that I was referring to before are often in the fourth tier of a drug formulary, and the fourth tier often carries a very high cost share. 30%, I've seen much higher than that, especially in Part D plans. But 30% subject to a maximum out-of-pocket can really hurt. And this is an important slide because it was a study of a group of 13,000 people in the Midwest in an industrial company that had in 2006 to 2007 a change in its benefit design from a traditional to a high deductible with a health savings account. And you see what happened overall, minus 25% cost in the first year relative to, this was a case control situation where they were looking at two employers, same area. They case controlled by the patient and tried to match different characteristics of the patients. So they're showing that comparing this plan, which in January of 2007 went to a high deductible with an HSA, to that other employer on a case managed basis, this one went down 25% in the first year, which was not completely sustained over time. But look at what happened with pharmacy. This is the pharmacy benefit. So it was statistically valid that it went down quite a lot the first year, and it remained down over time, which is not really surprising because the health insurance experiment at Rand Corporation many years before had shown that when increasing cost out of pocket to patients, they reduce use across the board, whether effective or not. This slide is from a survey of patients done by the Employee Benefits Research Institute, which shows how people think differently if they have a high deductible plan. So they check whether the plan would cover the care more often. They ask for generics rather than a brand name more often. So you can read down the list, but they're definitely more concerned about costs. They ask their doctor for less expensive drugs. They may be concerned whether they can even afford these drugs. And they do it much more than you would expect in a traditional plan. Pilot example, and I'll move it along a little bit because I'm running out of time. So this is an example of Healthcare having done a bundling of care in oncology, where they bundled therapy along with the physician's treatment. And what they found is that the actual overall cost of care was lower, even though the chemotherapy cost was higher, and they couldn't explain how that occurred. But bundling examples, there are several of them in the marketplace now. And I will like this one because it actually had gone to conclusion in publication. Another way of going, which would increase transparency, is just an idea that I had based on a request I had from a pharmacy benefit management company, which I need to very briefly explain. Right now what happens is that specialty pharmacies, SP 1, 2, and 3, and 4, buy drug from a wholesaler, get drug from the manufacturer. And then they essentially mark it up to the pharmacy benefit management company, which then bills the payer. And whatever services are provided by the specialty pharmacy are paid for within the margin of the drug, the difference between what they pay the wholesaler and what they get from the PBM. In this model, the idea is that the PBM would buy drug directly from the manufacturer and would pay the specialty pharmacy for services rendered, so that it would increase the transparency and there are a great many products that are going off patent these are biologicals now over the next several years. 41%, according to one analysis, of worldwide biologic sales by 2017. And this is like the opportunity. And these are just the products that are going off rather soon. Humira is the top one for rheumatoid arthritis. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilan. Alexander.
Make sure I flip all my switches here. Well, good evening. I want to thank the sponsors of the presentation for inviting me. This is really a treat for me. I don't get out much to do these kinds of talks. It's really a very important topic. The conference themes, as was discussed with us initially, was about this conundrum of innovation and pricing, and how can we deal with the, how could we ensure that we don't break the bank, at the same time don't choke off innovation. And it is an extremely challenging problem, and it's a problem for not only the innovators but policymakers, and I think also ultimately based on the economic and political health and status of the country at some point. I can tell you I do not maintain the sanguine views that have been discussed up to this point. So let me see, how can I advance my slides here? Sorry. Okay, got it. Thank you. So first of all, let me say, in deference to Martin, I used to work at Amgen. I am also a rheumatologist, and I don't want to date myself, but when I was in training in my rheumatology fellowship, there were I think we had 4 or 5 drugs. None of them had any formal FDA approval for the conditions that we had to treat. All of them were poisons. We had Amgen, one of their products is Enbrel. It's an anti-tumor necrosis agent, a biologic. Acts as kind of a sponge for tumor necrosis factor, which is promotes the inflammation of arthritis. And it really was a miracle drug, I have to say. And there have been several competing agents that have been just as effective. So that is an example of bench to the bedside innovation. However, that was 16 years ago, okay? And at the time, there were 2 or 3 such drugs. Now we have about 12 or 14, I think, by last count, okay? So we're almost getting into the Me Too phase of biologic therapies. But let me, I don't want to get too much off on a tangent, but to debunk the role that the payer is unsophisticated, I want to debunk the fact that I'm not just a payer, and then I hope to show you that I have some sophistication. But my dream when I was a medical student was not to work for an insurance company one day, but we do play a critical role in access to and affordability of healthcare. Like people of information on healthcare utilization patterns, we provide data to researchers, we provide data to pharmaceutical companies. We are evaluators in reconciliation of healthcare utilization patterns and expenditures with outcomes. We're very responsible cost containment and surveillance strategies, proponents for accountability for the healthcare dollar spent. And we also are innovators not in molecules, but in other things such as provider payment models. The problem? Well, the problem is a relentless increase challenging, okay? And I can tell you that for Anthem enrollees, drug claims costs now exceed medical claim costs for the first time. So, well, apologize for that. It's me. So it now exceeds doctor visits, procedures, cognitive care by physicians, imaging, organ transplant, surgeries. Costs alone surpass that. The highest drug claim costs are those that account for the lowest percentage of total drug claims. So drug claims can be viewed as kind of a surrogate for maybe individuals that have conditions of a certain prevalence. Oh boy, I really got to get going. 25 drugs accounted for 9.4% of total drug and 28% of drug spend. In the past, this is data fresh off the press, by the way. And from the last 12 months, 2014 to 2015, the top 25 drugs account for 6.6%, 32% of total drug claims spent. And like I said, there's not only and there has been a shift in the rank of those agents. So I'm going quickly here. So I'm going to skip that. So this is looks at this is data that I had to aggregate and because of proprietary issues. What you see on this side, if you're facing to the left, is ranked by cost of claims 2011 to 2012 by the drug category. Okay. And you see there the ranks of the conditions. And then if you go to 2014 to 2015, you see, which would be the drugs that I had talked about earlier, the biologics, that treat about 3 or 4 different types. Thing is insulins have gone from number 14 to number 3. Why? Could it be there's a rising incidence of those conditions? I don't know. The other important thing to note is the difference of antivirals for hepatitis C top 25. Oh, by the way, I'm allowed to tell you that last year, in this past 12 months, Anthem paid out $10 billion in pharmacy claims. Now, does not include medical drug claims. So the whole world of oncology, where providers get reimbursed for using drugs to treat patients in their oncology practices. Okay, and if you now look at the rank by percent of claims, so of the drugs that cost the most, are they, we might ask, are they treating relatively prevalent conditions? And from 2014 to 2015, you look at the highest ranking drugs fall to the lowest rank by percent of claims. So basically, there is a trend, and I'm not passing judgment. I'm not trying to say a challenge. It's the drugs that treat the patients with the rare conditions are beginning to come to the top of the cost rank, and it's something that we have to address. If you look at from 2011 to 2012, there's a fair number of pretty arrows there that would indicate, okay, high prevalence, high cost, okay? With the exception of a few there that have been persistent since then, i.e. chronic inflammatory conditions. Those are those high-tech high-tech monoclonal drugs. And then you also see some other patterns, multiple sclerosis, enormous advances in HIV, but it's still costing us a lot of money. So I'm going to skip here, although one of the things I want to talk about is, okay, how do we fix this problem? And I had some information, and I apologize for not timing the presentation better, about, the role of providers, but role of payers, what we can do. The bottom line is there's not a lot of quarters to find in the couch cushion to accommodate these trends, okay? So consumers will see increasingly premium pressures as a result of this. One of the things that I want to point out here is pricing by the pharmaceutical industry. And I have the 3 sins, but there's actually 4. I modified the slide without. Patriotism, rebranding, less than competitive pricing practices, and pricing transparency. And so this was an article in the New York Times that discussed the fact that a British family that had come to the United States suddenly could not afford asthma medications. Cost of $175 in the United States, where they got it for $4 or in some instances for free in England. Talking about Sovaldi, governments in other countries negotiate drug prices, but not in the U.S. It's against the law for the U.S. government to negotiate drug prices. Drug reimportation is against the law. Ask Michael McConaughey in Dallas Buyers Club, if you remember that. Americans, whether you realize it or not, are financing the discounts given to other countries for their drug use. These are the prices that are being charged in other countries, okay? This is an interesting, Gilead, the maker of Sovaldi, is going to give away in the country of Georgia, which is adjacent to Russia. I think that's great. There's a very high incidence of hepatitis C there. But the point is, who's really paying for this in the end? And the other thing is, it's not really a giveaway. Gilead, this is a massive geographical clinical trial that Gilead is going to use this data to broaden their indication for here in the United States. Now, I'm not going to say that's a bad thing, but this is not just a giveaway. There's more to it than just that. The other thing is that there's this practice of rebranding. Okay, I have to stop now, but maybe we can discuss at another point. I apologize for not being able to complete the full presentation. Thank you very much.
So because we leave a lot of time for questions, what I would like is the three panelists to come up here. I believe you're mic'd so the house can hear you as well as the recording. Oops, I have to stay put though. So if there's something that the speakers started to talk about that perhaps didn't have enough time or that you would like to ask them, now's the time to do it. We've got a full half hour, so they can get to some of the details of a particular interest or question. We do have a microphone, so if you wouldn't mind raising your hand, we'll be able to get the microphone to you.
Yes, Kerry Wright, alleged chair with the Los Angeles Association of Health Underwriters. Martin, you mentioned Europe, the percentages of drug use was going down, and I was wondering, what are they being replaced with? Is it being replaced with abstinence or palliative, or what's causing that reduction in their use of prescription drugs?
Yeah, great question, and I had, well, I went slightly over the 7 minutes, but I probably blew too quickly through it. It actually wasn't the use of medicines as an overall that has gone down. It is the proportion of the national healthcare budgets that was allocated to pharmaceutical spending. So in Europe, generally speaking, because of, for a lot of reasons, but Alex mentioned price controls and other direct downward price pressure. The amount of money actually spent on pharmaceuticals as a proportion of national budgets has gone the opposite of the modest gains in the U.S. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but for those people that suggest that pharmaceutical actually may be the one of the most rapidly advancing ways to get good outcomes in the medical care system, they've actually placed a different bet in Europe, and they're spending less of their money to purchase pharmaceuticals.
Another question from the audience?
I'm Tony Schiff. I'm a professor in the Department of Health Policy and Management. I'm a healthcare lawyer. I'd like to ask you, Martin, about Germany. You have a global understanding. Tell me about how the Germans manage their healthcare costs. They're obviously a high-performing economy. They're very technologically oriented. I remember it's Bayer's.
Right.
How do they handle, say, Gilead's drugs, just to pick on that company?
Yeah. I can't speak specifically country by country to the Gilead situation because I have my own 20 drugs to manage at Amgen, so I don't follow every country for Gilead as closely as the US. But I do know quite a bit about Germany because we have actually launched several products in Germany and are getting ready to launch some others. And so I'd love to talk a little bit about their system and how it differs from the US. I'll try and do it in a minute. I think you have to start culturally. Right, I think Germany is a society that, again, I don't want to offend any Germans, but I think it's a culture where the central management of healthcare is largely accepted as a cultural phenomenon in society, right? And so unlike many people in the US who I think resent having choices made for them or drugs denied to them or economics used perhaps as a basis for making drug selection, I think most folks in Germany, they may not like it, but they basically understand or maybe acknowledge that it is part of an affordable and sustainable healthcare system, right? It's just that's a difference in the culture. As a result, I think there's more levers that the German healthcare system has to pull to control the uptake of new products in Germany. One of the biggest levers that's used is to essentially deny benefits that would play in this country that are deemed not large enough. So for example, products in this country that are seen as providing rather large incremental improvements in end-stage survival for a cancer patient of 3 and 4 months are routinely called not clinically different enough from the competition. And when you basically are not clinically different or not clinically distinguishable, and they've chosen, a higher bar than we have, then you essentially are you have the right to negotiate with a monopsonist, which basically is saying, no different. Now we get to negotiate on price, and by the way, I'm the only buyer. So you can imagine what happens to your price when you're negotiating with a monopsonist who says that you're no different than another product. The other thing that they tend to do is require an extraordinarily high level of evidence, even flying in the face of common sense. So for example, we're actually in the position of launching a product in Germany that could very well displace a procedure in Germany that costs upwards of $80,000 per patient, which is much, much higher than we would basically be replacing it with drug therapy. Because there's not going to be a head-to-head trial, because Germany is one of the few countries that uses this procedure, and there's only probably 3,000 or 4,000 patients in Germany who get it, it is very likely that they will deny our treatment as providing a tangible benefit in that group. Even if we were to come a year later and show, look, 1,000 patients who were on this therapy are no longer on that therapy, and they're taking this thing that's 10 times less, inadmissible in Germany. So I think they basically use market power, and they also use kind of clinical hegemony to essentially draw a line where we're not willing to draw it here.
Okay, so that makes sense, but let me see if I can follow it up this way. So what you're basically saying is in that country, they use central buying of the government as a mechanism to, in essence, set and/or control price. And if that's the case, what did the other major Western European countries, Britain, France, Switzerland, Italy, what did they do? Are they also centrally purchasing and/or negotiating?
Well, it gets a bit more complicated. All of these systems, essentially, ostensibly say that the physician and the patient are free to make their decisions. So they do not overturn regulatory decisions. But what they basically do is they prevent drugs from being included on what you could think of as a national formulary. Some of these countries have a robust private health insurance market. As a matter of fact, many of them do. And the drugs are often reimbursed in the private market. Some of the drugs, actually, the decisions can be overturned by regional bodies or by individual hospitals. So, to imply that it is a monolithic system is probably going a bit too far. However, we come back to culture, right? Even if patients can afford medicines, they are so unused to paying for them, right? That even at the more modest prices, it's going to take some time, for the average person in a European country to even actually sidle up to make the types of co-payments we make in the US, right? Even co-payments are kind of an alien concept there. So I would say, the systems are quite different. There is more element of central control, but there's still quite a bit of heterogeneity. And not all stakeholders in these countries are aligned on what provides good values, because you see many parties that are free to make their own decisions actually make a decision that's contrary to the national basic formulary. Sorry, long answer, but quite different than the US. But we deal with it.
My name is Dr. Stephen Randall Henry. I'm a 2006 graduate of Department of Health Services, DRPH, and 1997 graduate of the Department of Community Health Science with DRPH, current founder and owner of Community Intelligence Public Health and Impact Research Consulting Company. My question relates to you, Martin, Dr. Zagari. You mentioned a cultural shift. I'll call it my brother's keeper. The innovations that you referred to, you said might require a shift in thinking, and that the co-pay, the payment systems would be distributed, where I might be paying, but the benefits might accrue to my neighbor. You mentioned that system. That takes quite a cultural shift because now, at a more modest benefits of the innovation and perhaps reducing costs. But as you just mentioned in the Germany context, that might be alien culture, a barrier, if you will. And you propose that, to be sort of controversial. So what sort of mechanisms, incentives do you think could be utilized to get U.S. payers to be our brother's keeper in that scene that you propose that, I'm paying, but my neighbor is the one who's going to primarily benefit from that?
Yeah. I don't actually want to speak for payers because I'm not one, but I can speculate a little bit just about the choices that we have to make as a society. And I find it a little ironic that when you go back 50 or 60 years and look at what health insurance was, I mean, health insurance was actually to protect you from catastrophic, debilitating, life-ruining illness, right? It was something you needed for cancer. It was something you needed if you lost an arm in an accident, right? It wasn't something that generally was used to pay for a $4 generic prescription, right, from Walmart or from some other place. I think that our healthcare system has now evolved so that people generally believe that health insurance should have a role in paying for almost every aspect of their healthcare, regardless of how cheap it is, regardless of how ubiquitous it's become. And I think that because the consumer is disconnected from what it actually costs, right? There is a markup process that occurs every time someone consumes care don't directly pay for, right? So a market trying to sell generic products directly to individuals who are paying out of their own pocket might settle at a price. Well, we actually see what the price seems to be, right? And there are markets like that. It's Walmart, it's Target, where people are paying out of pocket, and they're paying $4 a prescription. When that is something that people feel entitled to have paid for by something else, ironically, they pay more, right? I mean, copays for generic medicines, if you don't go through the time and effort to try and find a $4 one at your Walmart, right? Your copay is often $10 or $15. And I yell at my wife about that, right? She goes to the pharmacy and I'm like, you paid a $15 copay for a generic medicine. She's like, I don't have time for that, right? I don't have time to go to Walmart and go to a separate store for prescriptions. Right? And it's infuriating, right? Because she's paying 4 times the amount, right? And it's going through a payer, right? And so essentially that's a very inefficient sort of way to get resources to individuals, is to have every single aspect of care go through a payer. So I think there's a choice. I don't think we're going to be able to have everything as a society. I don't think we're going to be able to have every generic medicine paid for. Because again, my premise is that 90% of prescriptions are generic, right? They've become a commodity. And I believe actually that you want downward pressure on prices, and the way to do that is to expose people to that relatively modest commodity pricing. In exchange for that, you pick up essentially payment and coverage for the therapies that are, by most people's standards, unaffordable. Several of our products, I might have a different point of view than some other companies, because Amgen has largely focused on drugs that treat very debilitating or basically life-altering or life-shortening diseases. And that's basically been our area of focus, right? And we have not shied away from developing those products for diseases where there's only a few thousand people with the disease. But you can imagine when you make a decision and as a society that says we're going to come up, we have a targeted gene in ALL that more than doubles the lifelong basically remission rate for those patients, right? 3,000 patients is not a lot of cost to spread the $4.2 billion over. So I think we have a choice to make as a society. Find ways to make the kind of care that should be a commodity more commoditized so we can afford more innovation, or do we continue to overpay. I'm going to indulge me with one more example, because I'm a consumer of healthcare, and I'm not just a drug developer. So I went to, as most Southern Californians, we've gotten too much sun. I had a mole removed the other day, and I tell this story because I went to the dermatologist, and I think the charge was $100 and some dollars. I paid $20, but then he wanted to remove a mole. And the charge for the surgery, the 2-minute surgery where you tent the skin and go, was $800. And then the charge for the pathology read was another $600. So when all was said and done, there was almost $2,000, and there was a follow-up visit and all that. So, $2,000, right? Well, I actually believe that in order to make serious progress in this system, we're going to have to rethink the way that care is delivered. Because right now it's delivered like every step in the process has to be extremely regulated, extremely monitored, delivered by the highest professional. Whereas I would like to go to the dermatologist who's seen 10,000 moles, have him say, that looks bad. That's it for him. That's what I need. That's his expertise. Then I want to go to Moles R Us, right? And I want to have some guy who cuts a year, just tent the skin and do this and charge me $50, right? And he'll probably do as good a job as a dermatologist. And then I want to have it sent to India for the pathology read, knowing that we're going to audit 10% of the reads from the Indian pathologist, right? And I want to have all that done for $200, $2,000. And if we were to take that sort of approach to the parts of medicine that can be routinized, procedurized, and I want to see how many times my dermatologist says take that off and it's not malignant, and I want to compare that to other dermatologists, right? Those are the network effects that we need to take advantage of. When we're doing all that, I think we'll have plenty of money to afford the types of innovative treatments that we sort of struggle with right now.
I want to kick this over to
yeah,
Alexander
sure.
because a lot of this has to do with the payer side of this as well. And one thing I hear Martin saying is that on one hand, we need transparent, the movement is called actual pricing rather than all the markups and the discount expected, while creating an insurance pool for the solidarity, the actual insurance pool for those high risk things. And what's your read on this, Alexander, coming from the payer side?
Well, let me just, if I can just back up a little bit, and there's been a lot of mention of generics, and there's this perception that generics are just so cheap that if we just switch everything over to generics, we'll be able to pay for these expensive biotechnology drugs, and it's just not the case. The drugs that come out as generics are often exclusive generics, okay? So once that comes out in generics, so the manufacturer is still making a brand, and then there's an exclusive generic provider. If the original manufacturer hasn't paid off the generic maker to not make the generic drug, okay? So if you get that far, then you're going to have a generic drug, but it's going to be priced very close, and often what happens is that the manufacturer, the brand manufacturer, at that time lower their price of the brand drug to competitive. Let me just give you another example of this dynamic of generics and why it's not. What I hear Martin saying is, it's the system, it's lot of money there. There's enough money to go around if we could just fix these other things. But the fact is that there is no more. So first of all, we as payers are under enormous scrutiny, and this is here in the state of California and also by the Affordable Care Act. One of the slides I was going to show was actually a newspaper clipping. It appeared in the LA Times, I think a few days ago, that said California regulator thinks Anthem is charging too much for 170,000 people. There is not that level of transparency in the pricing of the pharmaceutical industry. And right next to that article, there was another LA Times article about a bill here in California that Governor Brown is trying to implement that exactly tries to get pharmaceutical companies to account for their pricing. It's already defined how much of the healthcare premium dollar Anthem can take home, okay? It's, 15% roughly. there's not that scrutiny in the pharmaceutical industry. When people say R&D, there is not the scrutiny at all as to what those R&D costs really are. Okay, so the pharmaceutical lobby is fighting this bill enormously here in California because it's really one of a kind. But the whole Affordable Care Act. Here's another thing. The angst about having a copayment for a generic drug. Walmart can decide which generic drugs it wants to charge you $4 or $6 or $12, whatever it is, and they can pick that list. They can pick and choose, and of course they're going to pick drugs where that is going to be profitable for them, because they're a big gorilla. They're a big purchaser. You have to understand is that and this is an important issue that's critical, I think, in this problem with innovation, because the insurance industry, as a result of the Affordable Care Act and previous, we have to cover everything, okay? We cannot not cover things, okay? We cannot say we're not going to cover Enbrel, or we're not going to cover Humira, or these drugs that were at the top of that list. We cannot say that. We have to cover everything. So that co-payment that you're paying is part of it's the same as your premium. It's to pay for everybody, okay? So that's where it basically, comes from. Now, the issues about other areas of waste in the healthcare system, there clearly is a lot of waste in the healthcare system. Like I said, I could give you anecdote after anecdote. And I think the solution is going to be around more provider accountability. And the areas where we could potentially see that is in what's called accountable care organizations, which is a model that has been promulgated in the Affordable Care Act, where providers actually begin to assume risk and take accountability. So one of the reasons that there is a certain amount of bloat and a bloat of specialists in the healthcare system is that basically, we accumulate specialists. Everybody through medical school wants to become a specialist, and there is a fair amount of. I'm sorry. That's not a specialty. That's not a specialty. You're all one of a kind. So accountable care organizations give healthcare, and you could rack up an accountable care organization however you want. You can take you can have a musculoskeletal accountable care organization. You could have an accountable care organization that's highly vertically hospital, supporting practice, et cetera. And when you get at that point, when there's a set amount of money that gets divvied up, these entities are going to decide, do we really need 4 cardiothoracic surgeons? There are new models emerging where we are trying to encourage providers, because the key is going to be with providers. That's a critical component of all this. We have to engage providers. I have learned over my experience working at Anthem that the healthcare system is a patient. The healthcare system is a sick patient right now, and the patient is floundering. Okay, it's not a healthy situation right now when we look forward. There's going to be some very difficult decisions, and me being an individual who's rapidly approaching Medicare age, I'm concerned about that. But okay, I'm sorry.
Some of what you're talking about is one of the studies also, Alon, that you had on your slide, that when given in a bundled payment, the actual cost of care went down because there was probably incentive less for billing for volume.
That's correct.
Right?
Cost went up.
Yeah.
It was very strange.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure that has to do with the fact that they're all not individually billing, but they see it as comprehensive care. But you had your hand up because there was something you wanted to add to this.
Make the comment that I agree with Martin about that this is really a financing problem when it comes to these very expensive drugs that need to be paid for now and that have been approved at a much later point in time. And I also agree that many of the populations for which these are targeted are very small, like 2,000, 3,000 people. So if I am a self-insured employer, a self-funded employer with 1,000, 5,000, a relatively small as opposed to 20,000 size employer, and I get one of these patients, I'm going to be really hurting as far as my budget. Especially if I'm a mid-sized employer and I'm unlucky enough to get one of these 2,000 to 3,000 in the United States. So I'm wondering about two different possible solutions. One is kind of a reinsurance for mid-sized employers to essentially spread the risk for these extremely expensive and very rare incidence cases that will blow their budgets. And the other is that as a country, I'm wondering if we can't have the same solution as we had for end-stage disease, where those people those are very expensive folks once they hit dialysis. And so are many of the people who are getting these very expensive therapies if they're for chronic use and not Sovaldi or the other product that, you use it appropriately and you comply and you're cured, period. That's not what this would be for. But there are many of these products that are extraordinarily expensive, and they must be taken for life. For a mid-sized employer, that's just not a sustainable cost. And the reason is that while most self-insured employers do buy reinsurance, on the first year that that patient shows up in the expense pool, the reinsurance will pick it up. The next year, the reinsurance premium will ratchet up, knowing that that patient's still in the pool, and the employer will pay it, that new reinsurance premium, or they'll pay the premium cost, whichever they choose. But the point is, it's just not sustainable. And I'm just wondering,
You're proposing a very liberal idea, and that's a single-payer system, so that risk is
for
spread among
only for those patients.
I have a question.
That would be
When
the
we
best
talk-
reinsurance program of all, I think, perhaps.
When we talk
It would
about financing, how could you finance something if you don't know the cost of it? How could you finance something when we talk about, okay, how can we, when I buy a car and I'm going to finance the car, I know what the cost is, and I figure out how can I afford this over a period of time. How could you finance when the ball is constantly moving, when there's no transparency? That category of drugs that now ranks in our top 25 underwent a 38% increase last year. Part of that was due to increased utilization, which is another topic, and the other part went into ingredient cost increases. Why? Where does it come from? I'm not saying it's wrong to increase the prices, but we have to justify, the payers have to justify when they increase premiums, why, and those get scrutinized. What is the basis for, over a course of a year, for agents to increase, 38%? So.
That's a rhetorical question. I want to find out in the last 10 minutes if other people have questions, or whether, Owen, you have any. So, anyone else in here? Jack, because we're going to hold you guys to exactly 8 o'clock.
I'm Jack Needleman. I'm a professor and chair of the Department of Health Policy Management. And a lot of themes have emerged out of the conversation. One is the issue but the common word that I heard all three of you use was value. So I want to talk a little bit more about values specifically. In the long run, the pricing of a drug like Solvera, like some of the rheumatoid arthritis drugs, are driven by the perceived value to the patient of getting the treatment and the presence of either perfect or close substitutes.
I'm sorry, of what?
Perfect or close substitutes. Thus, as drugs become generic, the prices do drop, is an example. But right now, for example, there are 4 or 5 drugs for the treatment of Hep C that are working their way through the pipeline. And when those hit the market, we won't be looking at $84,000 per year, $84,000 per course of treatment of Solvera. That price will drop because there'll be other competitive drugs in the market. That's the long run, however. In the short run, we think about the value. A lot of issues that emerge. One is whether the drug should be triaged to some patients and not others. Is the issue of differential monopoly pricing, as we see with some of the drug companies making drugs available at low or no cost to people with less insurance. But so I'm curious for both Alexander and Alon, as you think about the value proposition in the short run with monopoly or close to monopoly on these high expense drugs, what kinds of methods have been used and could be used to differentiate high value uses of those drugs from low value uses of those drugs to get more appropriate patterns of use?
Well, we haven't talked about evidence-based practice guidelines yet, but that is increasingly used. And in at least one, a practice guideline is being embedded in an information system so that at the point of decision making, the physician has access to what, and this isn't cookbook medicine, it's just what does the evidence say about, given the patient's circumstances, what is the appropriate therapy? So to me, one answer is, what does the evidence say at the point of decision making so that the oncologist, if it's that disease category, will make an evidence-based decision as opposed to making one that could be all over the place, as some have argued that they do, or used to do, perhaps.
So can you make that more direct to the issue of potentially high expense drugs with markets in terms of the numbers of patients that are potentially involved?
I can give you I can't get very specific, but the National Comprehensive Cancer Network has guidelines that are very broad and that don't include dollars. They're very broad in terms of, does this drug work? Does the evidence say it works? There's a company called P4 Healthcare that I was involved with in oncology that took the NCCN guidelines and worked with around the country to essentially skinny those guidelines down to based on dollars and what the evidence had said, and then paid the doctors for compliance at an 80% of patient level, an extra amount of money to be compliant to those narrower guidelines. So I can't get down to the drug level for you, but I can say that those NCCN guidelines became more narrow, and once the physicians received compensation for their level of, if you will, cooperation with them, then at least one insurance company called Care First in Washington, D.C. evidenced and published a substantial savings in oncology for, I think it was breast, lung, and colon.
If I could add it's interesting you raised the Sovaldi example. I think that, here's where, headlines, I think don't capture perhaps a system allowing market forces actually to have an impact, and I would say a favorable impact on the market. So, the drug came to market at $84,000 for a complete treatment, $1,000 a pill. About a year later, 3 or 4 major national PBMs have actually negotiated much better terms with the companies that actually make the two products now that are seen as somewhat close substitutes, the Abbott product and the Gilead product. And now the $1,000 pill is probably closing in on being a $500 pill. And meanwhile, 2 drugs that are not so good, one marketed by Vertex and the other by J&J, have actually been withdrawn from the market, right? Because they're no longer competitive. So I would actually argue that those are market dynamics at play, right? And again, my first statement, unsustainable trends are not sustained, right? The market sort of looked at those 2 drugs, found them comparable enough, thought that for the price discounts they were getting, their members could be persuaded to choose one or the other, or not choose, but to get one or the other. And I would say that's going to happen more and more. there are certain market distortions that sometimes don't allow that to happen. So for example, cancer is an area in this country, ever since we declared a war against cancer in the 70s, I think Richard Nixon did that, there have been a number of laws and protections for cancer treatments, right, that have led to some market distortions. And so I would say, again, Penguin, Alex, because I know there are real issues, is that I'm all for tackling market distortion problems.
We actually agree. Sustainable is not sustainable.
Exactly.
It's just you think we're going to land with a smooth landing. I don't. But anyway.
Yeah.
That's a great place to end. So I want to thank Martin, Alon, and Alexander. And thank you for all spending our Wednesday evening together. We have one more health forum in May. Two, one in June.
Yeah, good meeting you too, Alon. That was good.
Oh, I'm sorry, first week of June. So we have one more, first week of June. You'll be receiving an email. If you want to stick around, I'm sure that the gentleman here will be here for another question. Thanks.